Thank you so much. And yeah, I don't know what I'm supposed to say to follow that up because, see, I consider Carlos Martinez the expert on this topic. And I got to tell you, I was so deeply honored to be invited to participate in this delegation to China. It was my first time going to China. And I tried to go in with no expectations, having been subject to the same indoctrination about China that we all have been subject to, trying to drown out that noise and just experience China with an open mind, but not really an open mind because I'm a communist. So I'm expecting certain communist things, right? Because this is where we're supposed to get at least a modern interpretation of our communist principles in a current state. Um, so I was expecting, I think, some good examples of communist principles, right? Some good examples of socialist policy. But what I got instead was a lesson in what it is imperialists are so terrified of in regard to China. And that is the fact that I think China has proven, um, along with other revolutionary countries, China is the example for where socialism goes if it has the ability to develop naturally. And it can only develop naturally through a rigid and a vigilant protection of the revolution that produced the results that are being protected in the first place, right? So I think for me, China is the example of what could have happened in Cuba, what could have happened in Venezuela, what could have happened in Congo and African nations, what could have happened in Guinea-Bissau and Grenada, had those revolutions been allowed and those countries been allowed to develop without neo-colonial imperialist interference. That I think is the threat of China. Because I think for those of us who want a better world on the other side of capitalist domination, with capitalist domination and imperialism being relegated to the dustbin of history, what we want is an example of how these principles we have will work. We in this country believe that there is no example of a successful socialist country because what we have are examples of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and all of the African and global South revolutions that have been truncated or severely restricted and limited by continuing imperialist interference and domination. China is, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, China is, I think, the one country that exists currently that is the outlier to the imperialists' ability to limit a socialist program and its successful implementation. Because quite frankly, China's too big, it's too advanced, the people are too committed to what they have won for any imperialist force to thwart what they are still doing. And having seen all of this development in just the 5 cities that we visited, having seen the progression, the historical progression from a wholly feudal, uh, quite a backward, very much a war ravaged, hand to mouth, poverty-stricken country and population to the technologically advanced, socially stable, and I don't want to use the word utopia because there no such thing exists. But we do see in China a country in which the people are so committed to not just defending themselves and what they have built, but they want so very badly for the rest of the world to experience what they have, that they're willing to share it with everyone who genuinely wants shared shared prosperity, shared peace, and to let everybody develop the way they can and they want to. So the way I look at this question of whether China is a threat is is through the question a threat to whom, right? Because for us, for me and you, China is an example, right? And I don't like to valorize or put a nation on a pedestal or leaders on a pedestal because I'm an anti-imperialist and this is not what we do. We don't make heroes out of individuals because all humans are deeply flawed because we're humans, and we don't make utopian examples out of states because there are contradictions throughout. Because just because states are what they are, and because it is human beings that are shaping and running these states. And there are conflicts of interest, there are disagreements over principles, policies, and how those policies are implemented reflecting those principles. So, sure, there are going to be things that we don't agree with, things that maybe we wouldn't do if we were in this position to create this thing. And people get hung up on these things, but we have to remember, or at least I like to remember, as an anti imperialist, it's not my job and it's not my place to nitpick everything another state does or people in another state do to reach a conclusion that is beneficial for their people using socialist principles that I might not apply where I am. And that is okay. That has to be okay because that's a part of our dialectical materialism and how we analyze how we are going to apply these communist and socialist principles to our material conditions where we live and the historical conditions that shaped how we live where we are. And that, I think, is the great part about Chinese principles through the CPC and how they popularize and carry out their policies with those principles, undergirding them because they describe it as socialism with Chinese characteristics. And us outside of China, we basically know that as dialectical materialism, but we don't make the connection. Because all China is doing is saying that we agree with communist and socialist principles. We're just going to apply them to the historical and material conditions and the cultural conditions in China. So we're not going to do everything exactly the way the Comintern said. We're not going to apply every single analysis from Soviet communist leaders or maybe even Marx. But the principles, the basic principles we agree with, and we will shape these principles to our history, our current material conditions, and our culture that is encompassing of many different minority cultures. So even there is no one Chinese culture even. So when we look at the ways imperialists claim that China is a threat, they're always projecting what they do to be a threat, right? So when the West says that China is a threat to the rest of the world with its militarism, what they're really saying is trying to place on China things that they have done as imperialists, like extending their power and domination of other countries through territorial acquisition, war, land theft, genocide, or by using political or economic control over other countries. That's the key part of the accusation against China that people don't bring up enough. Imperialists are accusing China of doing what they do in terms of using policy and economic policies to control other countries. And they always cite the Belt and Road Initiative as an example of that. And they always end up in Africa when they do that. They always end up saying, well, I can tell you that China is imperialist because look at the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa and the debt traps, and they're trapping these poor African countries into these loans that they can't pay off, blah, blah, blah. This is the argument. But the truth behind the argument, not only behind the definition, that they leave out, the words they leave out, using economic and political policies to control other countries. China is not doing that through the Belt and Road Initiative. But they know that China's not doing that. So they leave that part out. And they make up these things about debt traps and Chinese businesses controlling African resources, China being the new imperialist power to come in and thwart African democracy. They don't talk about the instances in which China has responded to some issues that have arisen in some of these African nations with Chinese businesses. And I think this is a part of the way we talk about these issues, these contradictions that we can't pretend like are not there, but we always choose to talk about them in the same way that the imperialists talk about them, right? So yes, there are some concerns in some African nations about the role of these loans that that they say the Chinese government are roping African nations into. But here's the thing. There is no one lender in China. That there is certainly the CPC through certain banks that represent the Chinese government, but all loans that are issued to other countries throughout the Belt and Road Initiative are not issued by the CPC, right? And then there is the issue of these loans themselves, the debt trap myth that is created because China, the entity that the West hates, has issued loans outside of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that is the usual vehicle for these Western imperialist states to truly trap countries into an unmanageable debt issued by the IMF. China is not issuing these loans in the way that the IMF issues them. There is no ridiculous interest rate. There is no, if you default on the loan, China is coming to take your stuff. There's none of that. What China does instead is what we've seen reported a little bit in Western press, but not enough, is they issue interest-free loans, first of all. And then when these African nations experience an issue with repaying some of these loans, first of all, China is monitoring what is going on in the countries that the loans are issued in through the Belt and Road Initiative. So they understand the material conditions of these countries. They understand that they are in an economic situation that is very difficult for them. It's so difficult that they couldn't build their own infrastructure and they needed help. And why did they need help? Because of neo-colonial imperialism through the IMF, economic imperialism. China has a different way where they issue no interest loans to countries that they understand need the assistance. Is China doing it out of the kindness of their hearts? I think that's a ridiculous claim to make. But I do believe that when China says they want to share their prosperity that they have experienced with their development with the world, so the rest of the world can experience the same level of stability and prosperity, I believe that's true. Because who else is going to issue a loan with no interest on which they don't make any money when you pay it back? What are they gaining from issuing a no interest loan? So in that regard, China, I think, is absolutely showing that they mean what they say when they talk about shared prosperity through the Belt and Road Initiative. But they go even farther. If a country has a difficult time repaying the no interest loan, China has been known to forgive some of these interest-free loans. And again, we're not always talking about the CPC. Sometimes we're talking about a bank, another bank that is not necessarily closely connected with the CPC that re-examines the loan conditions and says, all right, we'll forgive the interest-free loan. Here's an example. There was a summit in 2018. China announced there that it had forgiven outstanding interest-free loans for older debts that were due by the end of that year for all African least developed countries that already had diplomatic relations with China. So in the way that even the Chinese government or these Chinese banks that are not closely related with the CPC handle their financial relationships with these African nations, there is no exploitation here. There is no domination of African nations through economic coercion, which is what the IMF does. China is not doing that. If they're going to forgive interest-free loans of 17 actual African nations that had matured or were due by 2018, and then, by the way, they did it again. They did it again in 2021. They also continually analyze these relationships, these financial relationships they have with Belt and Road countries, not just in Africa, but all throughout the world, to see if there are ways they can restructure the loans. And so even the cancellations that have been done is actually not as common as continually restructuring the debt in favor of the country that holds the debt or that has to pay the debt. So China is literally doing everything it can to not exploit the countries that it has offered these loans to. And then the countries that actually do exploit countries that the IMF issues loans to are running around saying that China is exploiting African nations with these debts, when China is actually the country that is forgiving the loans, the debts for for some African nations, and even restructuring the debts that exist so that these nations can have an easier time paying them back. And again, neither the CPC nor the other banks not associated with the CCC in China make any money off of these loans. They are no interest loans. So even just looking at the example of China and their engagement in Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative and how they handle the money part of it. Oh, just by looking at that, it is difficult to see how the myth of China being a threat to the rest of the world holds up. But again, there are too many really great examples of China doing all of the things that the Western nations who come up with these lies aren't doing, which is exactly why they continue to lie about China, because most Americans aren't going to go to China because we're broke and we're kept that way intentionally. So and the people who do go, there are so few of us, most of us are leftists if we're not capitalists who are because listen, China does engage in an aspect of open trade on the capitalist market because you have to pay for these programs in some way. Capitalism is a reality. But here's the difference that they also don't talk about when they demonize China about being. We used to do a show on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, and there used to be a guy who called in every day just about. And it didn't matter what we were talking about. He would always bring up China, and he would always say that the Communist Party of China is full of millionaires and billionaires who are exploiting the people, and they're no different than the West and on. And then I find out through my, organizing that a lot of people on the left in the US believe this. And I was floored, absolutely floored, that people do not understand that in China, yes, the CPC controls certain industries in order to raise money to carry out its socialist projects, right? So the money the CPC makes by trading building materials, steel, uh, food, oil, whatever, on the open market, microchips, technology on the open market, that money is used to fund China's socialist projects, like its housing project, which is massive, it is incredible, and it is the cornerstone of China's poverty alleviation program, which has already lifted more than 800 million people out of abject poverty in the country. Now, if there is a country in the world that has been able to eradicate abject poverty through social housing programs alone, just that one program. And to be clear, it's not that inequality does not exist in China. The CPC continues to focus on reducing inequality. But the reason the CPC has been able to eliminate abject poverty in China through its social housing programs is because it has control over the resources that are made through the sale of resources manufactured in China on the open market and redistribute those resources to the people through the housing program. So the government in China has massive social housing projects to provide shelter for its low income and vulnerable populations. People who claim, imperialists who claim that China is exploiting people through the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is why they're a threat, and they're trying to take over the market and U.S. dominance. China is too busy making sure that their people have their human rights met. The government is providing affordable, not just affordable housing for its people, but also price capped housing. And the government provides subsidized housing on one hand, and on the other hand, they control the commercial market also to reduce corruption in that area. This has absolutely reduced the cost of living for poor families in China, and housing is typically the largest household expense. So, by the Chinese government focusing on providing housing to its people, they free up income for their people for other things like food and education and healthcare, which education and healthcare also highly subsidized in China. So people in China, even people who are not rich, not wealthy, not even middle class, have more disposable income and a better living standard than certainly they had before the CPC existed, but they also have a higher living standard and more disposable income than even middle class people in the United States. So, is China a threat? Sure, China is a threat to the capitalist and imperialist system that ravages our lives here, the same system that ravages the lives of people in the UK. The people that China is a threat to are the people who want to privatize y'all's NHS. They're the ones who are threatened by China, not you. What China provides for us in the US, and I think what China provides for the rest of the world, is the threat of a good example. The threat of a really good example of what can work, that socialism does work. China is the threat of destroying the imperialist lie that communism and socialism are the threats to humanity. China represents the threat to the imperialist lie about communism and socialism, because China represents the evidence that they have been lying the entire time. And only because China is the most successful example, I think, of socialism being a rousing success in a country that has material conditions that are very similar or were very similar at one time to the material conditions of countries like Cuba and Venezuela. But China was able to marshal their resources to not only develop a very strong army at a fraction of the amount of money that is spent in European countries to be aggressors. China has been able to build a highly capable, highly advanced, very committed, and very patriotic to the people army for defense of the people and its project, where the people accusing China of being a threat are spending money that should be going to healthcare, housing, and education on an army to aggressively destroy China because their example is a threat to what humanity really needs. And that's just one or two aspects of what I have experienced that I can speak to just a tiny bit from what I understand a little bit better about China now. Contradictions abound, absolutely. I wish that they had been more forceful in their responses to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. However, again, as an anti-imperialist, I have to stand on those principles. I can't tell China how to respond to a global situation when I know that their principles, one of their main principles, is not getting involved in other countries' internal issues. But on the other hand, this is a genocide. This isn't an internal issue anymore. But these are contradictions that, as an organizer, we know are best hashed out within the confines of your organization. This isn't an argument we have in public. This is an argument or a discussion or a struggle session or whatever you want to call it that we have with our comrades in China, that we have behind closed doors. I am sure they're having these conversations in the CPC, right? So this is not to
Jackie, can
say,
you begin to just
absolutely,
finish up? Yeah.
yes. Yes, I'm trying to land my plane. Yeah. So this is absolutely not to say that China is where we need to go. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe we don't need to do everything the way China has done. But I do believe that China has proven that the lie that communism and socialism are the threats to humanity, I think they've proven that absolutely false, and that is the threat. Thank you.